Hi, I'm Cassandra Ganera. I'm the program head and an instructor in the Environmental Conservation and Reclamation diploma here at Lakeland College. I'm going to take a few minutes today and just talk about some of the jobs that our graduates from ECR can get in the energy sector. And specifically for this presentation, I'm going to talk about jobs associated with upstream oil and gas operations. So just to start off with some quick facts about the number of well sites that we have in Alberta, there's about 159,000 active wells. And active wells are wells that are currently producing oil and gas products. So they're sitting in our landscape and they are actively pumping out natural gas or crude or whatever product that might be. There are about 97,000 inactive wells. Now, an inactive well is a well that isn't currently producing, but could have the ability to produce in the future. And so it may not be producing because of an environmental concern on that site, or just the economy isn't strong enough or the price of oil and gas hasn't gone high enough to make that well currently viable to produce from, but could come back into production again in the future. There's 73,500 abandoned wells, and we consider an abandoned well to be a well that has finished the production from that site, meaning that no more product will be extracted from that well in the future. So at this point, an abandoned well typically would have the facilities start to be decommissioned and moved off that site, and then eventually it will move into that reclamation phase. Now there's an additional about 7,200 wells in Alberta that have been orphaned. And an orphaned well is a facility where the company that was responsible for that well has gone defunct, or it's gone bankrupt, or it's no longer in business. And so those wells end up with the Orphan Well Association in Alberta. And those wells will likely move through that abandonment phase and reclamation phase over the next few years. So this map here on this slide is just showing the number of abandoned wells that are near to Vermilion. So here's Vermilion, is this yellow box up in the left-hand corner of this map. And then each one of the diamonds on this map is representing one of these abandoned wells. So meaning it's done its production life cycle and it will be moving into reclamation at some point in the future. So you can see there's just a great big density of these wells, even very close to Vermilion. And if you pulled up maps of almost any place in Alberta, you would see a number of these wells because there are, over 73,000 of them in our landscape. Again, we're only talking about well sites here for this presentation, but other reclamation sites that our graduates would work on would be pipelines, oil sands operations, renewable energy sites, so windmills and solar panels, and thermal operations also have ground disturbance associated with them that needs to be reclaimed. Coal mining and other mining operations, brownfields, all of those types of sites also have reclamation associated with them. So if we, drive outside of Vermilion here and take a look at that landscape, we can see that there's a number of these facilities in our landscape. In this part of Alberta, of course, we would see these sites have these large black tanks sitting on them, and that's just due to the type of product that these well sites are producing. It's a heavier product, and they use these tanks as part of the extraction for that product, and a number of these across the landscape. So individually, a well site might not have a very large surface disturbance, but if we put all of those smaller disturbances together, they make up a very large portion of our landscape. So reclamation and production go hand in hand. Sites are continually reclaimed alongside sites in production. So sites are always at a different phase of reclamation. And so here is a example in our landscape of where we have this recently reclaimed site right alongside a site in production. So here's a site that is currently pumping crude, an active site, and then right beside it is a site that would have been active last year and looked very much like the site on the left. But you can see that the soils have been replaced, and then likely in the spring of 2022, this site will be vegetated by the landowner and just put back under agricultural production. In a couple of years, there will be criteria met and a reclamation certificate issued for that site. So prior and during site construction, ECR graduates may be responsible for a number of jobs. So we think about well sites having three phases. The first one is the construction phase, and this is when we are building that well site in the landscape. And typically these well sites are originally 100 meters by 100 meters in size, and all of the work that happens on that site is going to happen within that boundary of that well site. The second phase is that production phase when we're actively pumping some type of product from that site. And then the third phase is the reclamation phase where we're going in and we're reclaiming that landscape back to a equivalent land capability as to what was in the landscape prior to disturbance. So prior to construction is really when a lot of the reclamation work and planning should be done. So there should be consideration of where and how soils should be stripped and stored on that site. There should be consideration of how that's and what that site's going to be reclaimed back to. So some of the jobs that ECR graduates may be responsible for prior and during site construction could be soil surveys, so assessing and classifying the different soils that are present on that site. Vegetation surveys, so this can be taking an inventory of the vegetation present, as well as doing rare plant surveys, so looking for those species that are maybe protected on that site and would be key indicator species to the health of that site. Pre-disturbance site assessments, so this is looking at sort of a bunch of different parameters in that site, topography, again, soils, vegetation, any other site features that may either be helpful in the construction of that site or may make that site difficult for the construction of a lease. Things like soil monitoring and placement. So in Alberta, anytime we're disturbing soils and stockpiling them, a soil monitor has to be present on that site so that we're not losing any of the soil from that site. So it's a method for us to protect topsoils in Alberta. Or waste disposal. So our graduates, even before that site ever enters or becomes a feature in that landscape, there's a lot of different jobs that can happen in that or on that site. Okay, during production, the ECR graduates may be responsible for vegetation management on that site, so vegetation control and keeping the teardrop of a well site unvegetated. Erosion control, so some of these sites are cut into fairly steep slopes and there would be erosion control that continuously needs to happen on that site while it is in production. Spill response, so particularly in these heavier crude sites like we see in this picture here, there are trucks that come onto this site and access these tanks to remove the products that have been pumped into them. When we do that removal, sometimes we have spills. And ECR graduates may be responsible for the spill response protocols, as well as the cleanup and protection of the environment around that site if you have a movement of that spill off of the site. And then gas migration. So these sites have wellheads, and sometimes alongside the wellheads, we have issues with gas migration in the soils and out into the atmosphere, and that's something that is monitored and controlled when needed on these sites as well. So during the production, or if we're talking about those active wells, that 179,000 active wells in Alberta, there's lots of different jobs and opportunities for our graduates in that phase. And then once production has ceased and the well has been abandoned, ECR graduates may be responsible for the site decommissioning. And so that would be the removal of all of the infrastructure off that site, making sure that the wellhead is cut and capped properly, doing site assessments. So there are 3 different phases of site assessments that are an indication of what is happening on that site, and you move through those phases depending upon the level of cleanup or remediation that those sites need. And then also, of course, site reclamation. So that's actually stripping that site back to that original 100 meter by 100 meter lease, recontouring that site, working to reduce any amount of compaction you might have on that site, then replacing your subsoils and topsoils back to the original contours and lease shape. And then the final step is vegetation of the site. And depending on where that site is, this can be a relatively easy process, or it can be much more complex and in-depth. So if you're thinking about reclaiming a forested site compared to an agricultural site, the techniques and methods you would use to reclaim those 2 different types of sites would be quite different. So in the left-hand picture on this slide, we have a recently reclaimed well site again. So this well site was just reclaimed this year in 2021. You can see that the soils were again stripped back to the edges of the original lease site. The parent material that well pad was built on would have been recontoured, and then the subsoils and topsoils were put back over that site. Because it's an agricultural site, likely in spring of 2022, the landowner will seed this and put it back into production. The hope is within a couple years, they'll be able to come in using well site criteria and do detailed site assessments on this site, and eventually the company will be issued a reclamation certificate for this site. This bottom picture, this picture at the right here, this is a picture of a reclaimed well site from 2018. So it looked like the picture on the left in 2018. And now you can see that it's been put back under production by the landowner, and you really can't tell where the well site once was in this landscape. So I could draw it in. It sat around here with the access road coming down this way in the field. And that's really the ideal scenario for reclamation. We're hoping that we can eliminate those disturbances fully from the landscape once we're done on the project. So I hope that gave you an idea of some of the jobs that environmental conservation and reclamation graduates can have, and how it isn't only at that final phase of reclamation for an upstream oil and gas project, but in fact, there are many positions and opportunities prior to construction, during production, and then at that final reclamation phase. If you want to learn more about the Environmental Conservation and Reclamation Program, you can check out our website or feel free to contact me.